1. The night that changed everything. It was after midnight in Philadelphia when a single signature quietly rewrote American history. Rain pressed against the windows like a witness that refused to leave. Inside the residence, the president sat alone, holding a decision that would not start a war, but might tear the country apart. On his desk lay an order that would end the career of the most celebrated military hero alive. A man millions believed was untouchable. A man many trusted more than the government itself. This was not a moment of anger or revenge. It was colder than that, more dangerous. The president understood exactly what would happen next. Outrage, betrayal, accusations of weakness. He knew his approval would collapse. He knew his name would be cursed at dinner tables and shouted on factory floors. And still, his pen moved. Because the real threat was not the enemy overseas. It was the slow erosion of who truly held power at home. That night was not about one general. It was about whether a democracy could survive its own heroes. And that question still matters today. If you want more deep, cinematic stories about the moments that nearly broke America and the people who quietly held it together, subscribe to the channel now. Your support is what allows us to keep making these stories. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. A or B? A. The president acted too late. B. The president should never have acted at all. Comment A or B below, and let's see where you stand. By morning, the country no longer felt the same. The decision had traveled faster than daylight, carried by radios, newspapers, and word of mouth, in diners and union halls, in suburban kitchens and veterans' hospitals. Americans stopped what they were doing and listened. Some leaned closer, convinced they had misheard. Others already knew what it meant and felt the weight settle in their chests. The general was more than a man to them. He was memory. He was sacrifice given a face. For many families, his name was stitched into their personal history. Sons sent overseas, letters written, flags folded. To hear that he had been dismissed felt like an accusation against those memories themselves. Grief and fury tangled together, and no one could quite separate them. What shocked the nation most was not the loss of a commander, but the shattering of an assumption. Americans had grown comfortable believing that greatness could stand above rules, that certain figures were too important to be questioned. Now that belief was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling: uncertainty. Who do you trust when your heroes fall? Where does loyalty belong? To a man or to an idea? As the day wore on, anger filled the streets, but beneath it ran a quieter fear. The fear that the country was being forced to choose between comfort and principle. And once a nation sees that choice clearly, it can never unsee it again. While the country argued itself hoarse, one man did not rush to a microphone or issue a statement. He did not call reporters or float talking points. He waited. And that silence mattered more than anything said on the airwaves. The elder statesman was not famous in the way the general was famous. His name did not stir crowds or sell newspapers. Yet inside the government, and deep within the public conscience, he carried a different kind of authority. It came from decades of discipline, from battles fought without spectacle, from decisions made without asking who would applaud. He was known for doing the work no one thanked you for, and doing it anyway. In moments of national confusion, people instinctively search for a moral compass, someone whose judgment has not been bent by ambition or applause. For many Americans, especially those who had lived through war, recession, and political scandal, this man represented steadiness in a world that rarely stood still. He believed power should be invisible, not theatrical. That loyalty was owed to principles, not personalities, and that the most dangerous words a leader can hear are, "You're indispensable." As the noise grew louder and the country demanded someone to blame or someone to save, the elder statesman prepared to do neither. He would not protect a man, he would protect an idea. And in doing so, he would step into the most difficult role of all, telling the nation a truth it did not want to hear. The words were spoken without anger, almost without emotion. That was what made them devastating. The elder statesman did not argue the president's decision. He quietly redefined it. "You should have fired him 2 years ago." In that single sentence, the crisis stopped being about one explosive moment and became a story of long, accumulated neglect. He was not condemning a man so much as a failure of courage. 2 years ago was when warning signs were clear, when defiance first replaced discipline, when admiration began to outweigh accountability. By waiting, the nation had allowed authority to harden into entitlement. The sentence carried no satisfaction, only regret. It was the voice of someone who understood that history rarely punishes us for the decisions we make in panic, but for the ones we delay out of fear. At its core, the conflict was never simply between two men. It was between two forms of power that have always competed in American life. One kind of power is quiet. It works through rules, restraint, and patience. It understands that authority is temporary and borrowed, and that leadership means knowing when not to act. This was the power the president and the elder statesman believed in, a power rooted in institutions, not personalities. The other kind of power is visible and intoxicating. It thrives on certainty, spectacle, and personal destiny. It believes that success proves righteousness, that loyalty flows upward toward the strongest figure in the room. The general had lived inside this kind of power for so long that it no longer felt dangerous to him. It felt natural. Neither form of power is born evil. But history shows that only one can coexist with a democracy. The moment personal authority begins to outrank lawful authority. The question is no longer who leads, but who decides. And once that line is crossed, no victory on the battlefield can repair the damage left behind. For years, the general lived beyond the reach of ordinary limits. From his headquarters abroad, far from American scrutiny, authority settled around him like a permanent climate. In Rome, a city that once ruled the world by decree, he issued orders that reshaped lives and nations. There were no rivals, no equals, and eventually, no meaningful restraints. At first, this isolation seemed earned. He had delivered victory. He had brought order from chaos. But absolute authority has a way of changing its holder. Surrounded by admiration and shielded from dissent, the general stopped hearing resistance as wisdom and began to hear it as ignorance. Decisions were no longer debated. They were announced. Accountability faded into ceremony. Distance from home deepened the transformation. Years passed without challenge, without correction, without anyone saying no. Power, once a responsibility, became an identity, and when authority is no longer questioned, it no longer feels borrowed. It feels owned. That illusion would prove more dangerous than any enemy he ever faced. At some point, authority stopped being something the general exercised and became something he was. The uniform no longer represented a role. It defined him. Every decision, every victory, every sacrifice fused into a single belief that his judgment and the nation's interest were indistinguishable. To question him was not disagreement. It was disloyalty. Those around him adjusted accordingly. Advisors softened bad news. Subordinates learned which concerns to bury and which praises to repeat. The echo grew louder, and the silence grew safer. In that environment, reflection feels like weakness, and humility feels unnecessary. The danger was subtle. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. The general still spoke of duty and country, still invoked honor and sacrifice. But beneath the language, something fundamental had shifted. Command was no longer a responsibility entrusted by civilians. It was a personal mandate justified by past success. When leadership becomes identity, correction becomes impossible. Any limit feels like an insult. Any order feels like a negotiation. And when a leader reaches that point, the greatest risk is no longer the enemy beyond the horizon, but the certainty within himself. In the capital, the first warnings did not arrive as sirens or scandals. They came as small irregularities, orders that returned with revisions, timelines that stretched without explanation, briefings that sounded confident but answered the wrong questions. To most, these were inconveniences of bureaucracy. To the elder statesman, they were symptoms. He noticed how language had changed. Directives were no longer followed but considered. Civilian guidance was treated as suggestion rather than command. The general was not openly defiant. He was something more unsettling. He was selective. He obeyed when it aligned with his instincts and delayed when it did not. Inside closed offices, concern grew, but courage lagged behind it. No one wanted to be the first to confront a legend. No one wanted to carry the burden of being wrong. Silence felt safer than conflict. The capital had seen this pattern before. Institutions rarely fail from a single blow. They erode when small violations are tolerated in the name of convenience or admiration. The alarms were sounding, but they were quiet, and that made them easy to ignore until ignoring them was no longer an option. The war did not create the fracture. It revealed it. Under the pressure of real combat, every assumption was tested, every habit exposed. For the president, the conflict was a problem to be contained, managed carefully within political and moral boundaries. He saw war as a tool of last resort, not a proving ground for personal ambition. Every decision was weighed against consequences far beyond the battlefield. For the general, the war meant something else entirely. It was clarity. It was purpose. It was the chance to finish a story he believed history had already chosen him to complete. Limits felt artificial. Caution felt dishonest. The idea of restraint clashed violently with a lifetime of being rewarded for boldness. As orders crossed oceans and reports flowed back to the capital, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The same war was being fought under two entirely different assumptions. One side believed control was strength. The other believed control was weakness. War has a way of stripping away diplomacy and revealing character. In this case, it exposed a truth no briefing could conceal. The system and the man commanding in its name were no longer moving in the same direction. The victory was undeniable, against the doubts of planners and the warnings of analysts. The general delivered a result so decisive that it stunned both allies and critics. News of the success raced home, and for a moment, the nation exhaled. Pride returned. Confidence surged. The general was hailed not just as a commander, but as a savior. Yet beneath the celebration, something subtle but permanent shifted. The victory did more than silence opposition. It rewrote the general's relationship with authority. Caution, once tolerated, now felt unnecessary. Advice, once considered, now seemed inferior to instinct. If his judgment had triumphed where others hesitated, why should it ever be constrained again? Success can be more dangerous than failure when it teaches the wrong lesson. In this case, the battlefield confirmed the general's belief that he alone saw the truth clearly. The system that had questioned him appeared small, even timid, by comparison. From that moment on, restraint looked like weakness, and limits felt like obstacles placed by people who lacked vision. The victory did not merely change the course of the war, it changed the man who commanded it, and in doing so, pushed the nation closer to a reckoning it could no longer avoid. The meeting was meant to project unity. Instead, it revealed distance. When the president arrived, He expected at least the quiet rituals that signal respect between civilian authority and military command. What he encountered was something colder. The general did not rush. He did not adjust his posture or his tone. He did not acknowledge the moment as extraordinary. To an observer, it might have seemed trivial. To those who understood power, it was unmistakable. Disrespect does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears in what is omitted: a delayed greeting, an unbuttoned collar, a casual glance at a watch. In that setting, every gesture carried weight. The message was subtle but clear. The general no longer saw himself as subordinate, but as equal, perhaps even superior. The president absorbed the insult without confrontation. He had come seeking assurance, not a contest of pride. But something fundamental shifted in that exchange. Authority, once assumed, now had to be defended. The elder statesman would later understand that this moment mattered not because of its optics, but because it revealed a deeper truth. The general was no longer merely testing boundaries. He had begun to live beyond them, openly and without apology. The promise was delivered with confidence, almost casually, as if the future were already settled. The general assured the president, and through him, the nation, that the worst was behind them. The fighting would be brief, the sacrifices limited. Families were told to expect reunions, not funerals. Hope traveled faster than doubt ever could. But promises made from certainty are often blind to reality. Intelligence warnings were brushed aside. Weather, terrain, and the will of the enemy were treated as secondary concerns. The general spoke not as someone weighing possibilities, but as someone announcing destiny. For soldiers on the ground, the promise became something they carried with them into danger. For families back home, it became something they clung to through sleepless nights. When events began to unravel, the emotional cost was immediate and brutal. Trust, once given freely, does not fail quietly when it breaks. The president understood the damage at once. A broken promise in war is not merely a strategic error, it is a moral wound. And as reports grew darker, it became clear that the general had not just misjudged the situation. He had spoken beyond his authority, turning confidence into commitment without consent. That promise could not be kept, and the price would be paid by others. The collapse did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, disrupted supply lines, confused orders, units moving without clarity. What had been described as a controlled advance turned into a desperate effort to hold ground. Cold, exhaustion, and uncertainty replaced momentum. On the battlefield, soldiers sensed it before the reports reached the capital. Something fundamental had gone wrong. For the general, this was the moment when confidence cracked, faced with events he could not control. His tone shifted from certainty to urgency. Explanations became accusations. Responsibility was pushed outward, to weather, to intelligence failures, to decisions made far away. The calm authority that once defined him gave way to something sharper, more defensive. Panic in leadership does not always look like fear. Often, it appears as escalation. The general began searching for drastic solutions, not to stabilize the situation, but to reclaim the image of control he believed was slipping away. Every setback felt personal, every loss an assault on his legacy. The president and the elder statesman saw the danger immediately. When a leader begins fighting not to win a war, but to preserve his own reputation, the cost is no longer measured in territory. It is measured in lives and in the stability of the nation itself. There are moments in leadership when debate ends and judgment begins. This was one of them. As the situation worsened, the general's proposals grew darker and more extreme. What he framed as bold solutions crossed from strategy into recklessness. The language of necessity replaced the language of restraint, and risks once considered unthinkable were now presented as unavoidable. For the president, these suggestions struck at the core of civilian authority. They were not merely military options. They were political and moral decisions being claimed by a man who did not have the right to make them. The elder statesman saw it with painful clarity. This was no longer about winning a war. It was about who held the power to decide how far the nation would go, and at what cost. Some lines exist not because they are convenient, but because they protect everything on the other side of them. To cross those lines in panic is to gamble with the future itself. The elder statesman understood that history would forgive hesitation more easily than it would forgive catastrophe. At that moment, loyalty to the Constitution demanded something brutal and final, the refusal to go one step further. The evidence was not gathered in public hearings or shouted across conference tables. It lived in quiet rooms, inside folders stamped and restamped, read only by those trusted to handle consequences. The elder statesman withdrew from the noise and immersed himself in the record. Cables, memoranda, transcripts, decisions made in private and statements made in public. He was not searching for a single mistake. He was searching for a pattern. And the pattern emerged with brutal clarity. Again and again, the general had stepped beyond guidance, reshaping policy through implication, delay, and carefully chosen words. Orders were reinterpreted. Intent was blurred. Authority was tested, then stretched, then quietly ignored. None of it looked dramatic on its own. Together, it told a different story. What weighed heaviest was not incompetence, but intent. The elder statesman realized that the general was no longer merely reacting to events. He was shaping them to force outcomes the president had never approved. War and peace were being nudged, not debated. In that room, the final illusion collapsed. This was not a clash of personalities. It was a breach of trust. And once trust is broken at that level, no amount of victory can repair it. No one entered the room believing there was another choice. And yet, no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. The senior leaders gathered with the weight of history pressing down on them, fully aware that what they were about to decide would outlive their careers, their reputations, and perhaps even their lifetimes. This was not a question of tactics. It was a question of survival, of the system itself. One by one, the facts were laid bare, not opinions, not emotions, evidence. Each voice carried hesitation, not because the conclusion was unclear, but because the cost was so high. To remove the general meant tearing apart a national myth. It meant accepting public outrage in exchange for institutional integrity. The elder statesman spoke last. He did not argue. He summarized, in calm, measured language. He made it impossible to pretend this was about pride or politics. The general could no longer be trusted with the authority he held. Silence followed, heavy and final. When consensus came, it arrived without relief, only resolve. Leadership, in that moment, meant choosing what was right over what was bearable. The decision no one wanted became the decision that had to be made. When the general returned home, he did not come back in disgrace. He came back as a symbol. Crowds lined the streets, not to question him, but to celebrate him. Applause rolled like thunder, as if volume itself could rewrite events. For many Americans, this was not a fallen commander. It was a wounded hero finally restored to the people who loved him. The general understood the moment instinctively. He stood tall, absorbed the cheers, and allowed the nation to see what it needed to see. Strength, sacrifice, vindication. In his speeches, emotion replaced explanation. He spoke of duty, of loyalty, of battles fought far from home. He did not argue the facts. He appealed to memory. The president watched from a distance. aware that history often moves in waves of feeling before it settles into judgment. The elder statesman knew this too. Popularity is powerful, but it is fleeting. Crowds respond to stories, not systems. That return was the final act of a long performance, one that reminded the nation how easily admiration can drown out accountability. The hero had returned, but the truth had not changed. The Republic survived not because it was popular, but because it was protected at the moment popularity became dangerous. When the decision was finally carried out, nothing about it felt triumphant. There were no celebrations, no sense of victory, only endurance. The president accepted isolation, knowing that leadership sometimes means standing alone while the nation shouts behind you. The elder statesman accepted something just as costly. He spent the moral authority he had spent a lifetime earning, fully aware he would never get it back. What saved the country was not force or brilliance, but restraint, the refusal to allow admiration to override law, the insistence that no individual, no matter how decorated or beloved, could stand above the system that gave that authority meaning in the first place. History rarely pauses to thank those who prevent disasters that never happen. But this was one of those moments. The war did not become something far worse. Civilian control did not fracture. The Constitution did not bend to charisma. The general would fade, the anger would cool, and long after the cheers were forgotten, the Republic endured, quietly, imperfectly, and intact, because a few leaders chose principle over comfort when it mattered most. This story is not ultimately about a president, a general, or an elder statesman. It is about what happens when admiration begins to replace accountability. The general rose because he was brilliant, decisive, and victorious. Over time, those qualities hardened into certainty. Certainty became entitlement, and entitlement slowly detached him from the very system he once served. The president faced a different test, not of courage in battle, but of courage in restraint. He chose to absorb anger, humiliation, and isolation to preserve something larger than himself. The elder statesman stood between them, not as a hero, but as a guardian of principle, willing to spend a lifetime of trust in a single moment to stop a disaster that history would never fully see. The lesson is uncomfortable but essential. Real leadership is not proven when everyone agrees with you, but when doing the right thing makes you unpopular. In our own lives, this applies everywhere, at work, in families, in communities. When someone's success or charisma excuses their behavior, when silence feels easier than speaking up, the cost is always paid later. Accountability delayed is accountability denied. Here's a quick question for you. Comment A or B below. A. Strong leaders should be protected, even when they bend the rules. B. No individual should ever be bigger than the system. What's your perspective on this story? Do you agree or disagree with how it ended? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your view. And if you want more deep, thought-provoking stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support future content.